The Real Housewives of Hobbiton.
Oh, no.
Red shirts have names.
Get out.
Oh, man.
We're kicking him out.
That's
gonna be an anthology right there. We're gonna have to get 10 people. Everyone's gonna create a different little housewife of the Middle Earth, and we're gonna have like a whole.
There you go.
That would be so ridiculous.
Housewives of Middle Earth. Just
Oh my God.
Like, I am from Rohan. Oh, right over you, Hobbit. It's like, got it.
Hope the future generations can get this urge. Stay woke, youngin', and avenge these nerds.
What's up, guys? Welcome to another Nerds Around Creator Series. This is your host, Sebastian.
It's your boy Law.
anybody Tone from across the hall.
And today we're excited to bring to you a creator and also the founder of an awesome company that's putting out some great media out there. We want to introduce you guys to Chris Van Dyke from Skullgate Media. Chris, what's up? How you doing?
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
Glad to have you back.
Of course. Thanks to have you.
Awesome, yeah, cool.
So, Chris, we like to get everyone to tell everybody their origin story, their comic book origin, and how they started. What inspired you to become the writer you are today, and what inspired you to build Skullgate Media?
All right, well, you get the issue zero to go back to the beginning. I mean, like a lot of creative, like I was writing since as long as I can remember. I think my first book, I was 4 years old, and my grandmother helped me write it out because I couldn't write yet, and she stapled it together for me. So I've been writing and creating for as long as I can remember. And then, I'm 42, and it sort of took a break after college. Like, I did it really casually, but I didn't pursue publishing anything until about 4 years ago. And then I started playing D&D again after a long break. I hadn't played D&D in like 15 years. And I started playing D&D, and I was the DM because that was always my role back in high school too. And so I'm writing all the stories, and at some point, I was like, I like the writing part of this. And my friends were like, you're putting like 6 hours a week into planning these sessions, dude. You should turn this into something. So it's like, maybe I'll write a book. And so that turned into a book. I just remembered how much I liked writing. So then I started doing some short stories and doing some books and things. And then COVID is what kicked off Skullgate Media. Like everyone else in the world, I was stuck at home and bored with more time on my hands than I'd had previously. And I was on Twitter, and somebody asked me if I wanted to be part of an anthology, and I had a lot of time fun writing my story. So then I thought, hey, I'd like to do that. And so I put out a tweet and said, hey, who'd like to join me writing a book? And about 40 people said yes in the first 24 hours.
Nice.
And what started out, it was going to be just like a PDF. My first plan is it's going to be a zine. Like, we'll put it on my website, people can download it. And by the time we were done, we had an ISBN number. We had an actual cover. We had a print edition, and decided to make a company out of it. And so that was last August, and here we are. I've got 5 books out, and 4 more coming out this year. Yeah, so The Under New Suns is the second book in this anthology series that we're doing, and as you mentioned, we're gearing up. We're recruiting for book 3 right now, and the premise of the series is that each book is an original world that the authors create together. So I actually was inspired by, there's this indie sort of role-playing game called The Quiet Year by Avery Alder, it's a world-building game. So nobody plays a character, but you sit around a table and there's prompts, and you create a world together. And I thought it was awesome, but I wanted to scale it up. So I basically did a homebrew, hacked the rules, came up with the rules so we could do it using Google Docs and 25 people. And so that's for each of the first 2 books. We did that. We're changing the rules up for 3, but the premise is still, we get a group of strangers together, and the first thing we do is we create a world from scratch. Everyone gets a turn. You go around and you add an element, or you add a plot piece. So for the first book, it was sort of this dark fantasy. I was actually inspired by the Dark Sun setting from D&D, if you remember that from the 90s, the sort of post-apocalyptic. So I wanted to do something. So that was book 1. Then book 2, we decided to do just sort of pulp fantasy, or not pulp fantasy, sci-fi. We want to do like a space opera. And so I sort of came up with the seed idea. I wanted to be a little more episodic. So it's like, we're on a spaceship that's on the other end of the galaxy. We don't know how we got there. Sort of Star Trek Voyager-ish. And it's like, we go from there. We know nothing about the world. We don't know about the technology. We don't know why the ship's there or where it happened. And so each turn, everyone had a little prompt, and they got to add something about to the world. It'll be like, the most important person on the crew gets sick. Who is it, and how does it affect the crew? And so that person, for their crew, they'd get to like make up who is the most important person in the crew, and they add a little of their backstory. And each turn, someone would create a member of the crew as well to give us a little more details about. So by the end of the game, we had 25 crew members. Each person had come up with their backstory, and they'd come up with sort of a year's worth of events that had happened on the ship. That was, again, so it's a sort of a combination between like D&D and an improv comedy troupe. And so that's sort of the framework, and then everyone goes and writes a story set somewhere in that universe, and it can be the story, it could be the piece they provided to the game, or it could be something else. It could be some people did like medical records, some people did poetry, a few people did they do like a study of the marine biology on a certain planet, and other people just did more straightforward, here's an exciting caper about a sexy space pirate. And so if you read the book, it doesn't necessarily tell one big story, but it's a whole bunch of little pieces that are all sort of it's almost like fan fiction for a IP that doesn't exist, in one way.
I like that.
With Skullgate Media now, there's 5 of us. I'm the founder and president, but there's 4 other people who help me run the company. There's Colleen Stories, Chris Durston, Diana Gagliardi, and Debbie Yanku. So I'm not the only one doing this. And so we've been having to sort of figure out with book 2, we're like, we can't just take anyone who wants in. First of all, there's too many people, and B, we want to do a quality product now that we actually have a company. And it's a weird vetting process, because normally with an anthology, people send you a story, you look at it, you go, I like the story, I'm going to print it. Whereas with this book, we're going to say, you're going to write a story after you've joined the group, and we're just going to assume and trust that what you're going to write is a good story. So at the vetting process currently is people send us a writing sample from some previous work, and then they basically send a little, almost like blurb of, this is why I'd like to be part of this weird project you have going. And our first step is we read the writing sample blind without looking at anything else, and we sort of sort through as a group. We have this color coding system. All of us read it, and like you give it a green if you love it, like a red if you hate it, and a yellow in between. And so then we look, anyone who has all greens, 3 or 4 greens, moves on to like the next round. And then we look at all those, and we sort of look through what people have said, and we try to aim for a diverse group. Once we've sorted that down, we're looking for, we'd like our books to have, people of different ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, LGBTQ, we've had people from Israel to India to England. And so that's part of it too. We don't want it just to be, 25, white dudes that look like me, all sitting around enjoying our old, D&D from the 90s.
Right.
And we've had authors in their 60s and authors who are in their 20s. So we want to have a group where it's going to be interesting and different. And we've actually, each book had a bunch, like we've had people in the fantasy book who've never written fantasy, and people in sci-fi who've never written sci-fi, which I think brings really interesting ideas too. It's not just, I love Orson Scott Card, so I want to write a space book. It's actually, normally I write adult romance, but I'd be interested in writing a science fiction story with you. It's like, sure, let's try it out.
Yeah, definitely. Like you see it. Like I know in your piece that we wrote, like it's based in, that you wrote in volume 2, that it feels like it's based in a sci-fi setting, because they're on the ship and she's dealing with Dylan, who reminds her of her brother. But there's a lot going on with Suzanne that's through the inner monologues that we get, and we're finding out more about her and her story in the sci-fi story. And like, we know a little bit about the ship being alive and the interactions with the ship and being sentient, and the ship having a name and a gender identity. And it's just, I totally see that, where we're not just getting people doing a thing, we're getting stories about people in the ship. And we got the same thing too with Ari's story, I, where we learn about the character and the responsibilities that he's going through, and how he's breaking away from the collective and finding his own singularity. So I totally jive with what you're doing in the book.
Cool. Thanks.
I love that you have a cyberpunk series, man. And the cyberpunk series called Postcards from Neo Tokyo. What was the creative process creating this book? And can you give us the viewers and listeners a description of the book? And where can we get it?
That's that you can get on Amazon. That one is mine. It's actually not a Skullgate thing. It's just my own project. I actually did it before starting Skullgate, and I'm working on book 3 now. Actually, the genesis of that is sort of funny, because I got into trying to publish, And I quickly realized that there was sort of the self-published route and the traditionally published route. And I think a bunch of people were having a lot of success self-publishing sort of serial novels. And so it actually started with so this is Charles Dickens, economic. I was like, I want to write a serial. Like, I'm just going to write a bunch of short little books and see what I can do with that. So it started out more, it's like, I want to write something that could sell. And I was like, what could be serialized? So it's like, well, it's like Pulp Fiction. I was like, why not do Pulp Fiction? I like doing sci-fi. So I was like, all right, cyberpunk. So really I actually came to it. I was like, what could I sell? And then so I decided I wanted to write something that would make for a serial. So I came up with a character who's sort of a, somewhat stereotypical, but I'd like to think, unique, private eye. She's slightly alcoholic. She's a little burned out. She's missing her dead girlfriend. All sort of hidden some of the dark cliches, and then just gave it a sort of a cyberpunk spin. And the first one, I just sort of outlined, and I wrote that in a month, and then I wrote the sequel to it. And then I paused when I was starting Skullgate, but I've actually outlined a whole 8-book arc, and I'm working on book 3 to that now. So that's it's sort of it's cyberpunk. It leans a lot more into the get into sort of the noir aspect of it. It's a little less hacking and a little more just sort of like she's a private eye. She's living in the city that's dominated by robots and artificial intelligence. The premise behind it is almost sort of like an Amazon Prime gone out of control. The dystopian future is that 10% of the populace lives in opulent wealth while the rest live in abject squalor. And it's because the AI bots were programmed to optimize the average happiness. And they realized the best way to get the average happiness was make some people super, super, super happy because it didn't matter how unhappy everyone else was because the average still goes up. So as long as you can have 10% of the populace completely mind-alteringly happy, it doesn't matter what happens to everyone else. And so as AI, they just went about making the richest people happier and happier while ignoring everyone else. So that's sort of the world-building backstory to it. And the ultimate, it's like her versus the robots, and there's sort of a Terminator element going on as well. And she keeps encountering this freedom fighter who's a running character who becomes more and more part of the plot.
You also wrote a fantasy story the Far Home Elf Chronicles, which again that caught my eye. And it was a new series that you have releasing actually this year, November 2021. And it was inspired by your son. How important was it to come out with this series, and tell us what was it like to make this book approachable to young readers?
So that book, I was writing mainly because my son has dyslexia and ADHD. He's 12 now. And it's always been a struggle to get him to read. He just doesn't like reading. We've tried comic books, but actually with his dyslexia, he actually finds that more confusing. He doesn't like reading graphic novels either. And a lot of kids do, but just that hasn't been his thing. And so at some point, I couldn't find any books that he was interested in. And so I decided, well, maybe I could write one because he loves it when we read him Harry Potter. He loves it when we read him. I'm currently reading The Lord of the Rings at bedtime. He likes all the Percy Jackson books. He just doesn't like reading himself. And we could find books at his reading level, but they're just increasingly less and less interesting to him. I couldn't find, so I could find books that had fairies and elves in them, but they all tend to be like talking animals and girls with their fairy dragons or something. And there's some great books, but just as a 12-year-old kid, he wanted some action epic adventure. And so that's what I tried to set out to do. And so the first book, I outlined a quick story, and I decided I wanted to keep them short too. Because part of it is just the length, that if you're a struggling reader and you pick up a book, even if it's 200 pages, it looks like you're never going to get through it. So I'm a high school teacher, and I teach in the public high schools here in New York. So I've taught struggling readers for a long time, and getting that sort of level of confidence if I can read a book that I'm actually interested in. So I set out to write it both with sort of simpler sentences. I'm trying to keep the reading level low without coming across as being overly simple, and trying to keep the book shorter, but also, having also the action and adventure of a more adult fantasy novel. So that's evolving. I just finished book 4 of that, but book 1 does have a publisher with a small publishing company called Kindred Inc., and that is coming out in November and will be my first book published by someone other than myself. So that is exciting.
Nice. Congrats.
Thanks.
What was your class in Dungeons and Dragons aside from being a DM when you were playing? What was
Ranger.
Ranger?
Yeah, I was almost always the D. Like I was the kid that found the game, which I think is what that dooms you to be the dungeon master forever. The first kid to show up with the rule book and go, "Hey guys, I got this game I came across." Especially back in the '90s where it wasn't like everywhere. Actually, my first game wasn't Dungeons and Dragons. It was the Middle Earth role playing game by the now defunct Iron Crown Enterprises. I found it in a Walden Books in a mall in my summer of my 6th grade year. And my parents told me I could have money to buy a book. I'm like, can I get this thing instead? Because it says Lord of the Rings on the front of it. And that's it. I'd never heard of a role-playing game. I didn't know what it was, but it had The Hobbit on it. And I was a huge Tolkien nerd. So I took it home, read the rules, and then taught all my friends how to play. So I was the DM basically for life. But when I got to play, I'd be a ranger.
Hashtag forever DM. But Rangers, yes, so happy. My first character is a Ranger. So
yeah, I was always a big fan of some of the underpowered characters. Like I don't know, for some reason I like to almost play like the everyman for some reason. I didn't want to be. I wasn't a min-max or little munchkin.
Like some people that we know.
What are some obstacles that you have faced as an independent creator? How did you overcome them? And what advice would you give to or would like to share to various independent creators out there, whether they want to get into writing or anything or in this field?
Cool. I guess the biggest challenge